Warning: this video contains historical situations and historically correct language that may be offensive to modern audiences. Wherever possible, the language has been changed to reflect the modern sensibilities. The subject matter of this, in and of itself, may be offensive to some viewers. If history doesn't offend you, you're watching propaganda. Welcome to my Mid-Victorian crisis, and welcome to an episode of Victorian Influencers, a series where we look at the influential men and women from 1837 through 1901. Throughout this series, we will be looking at men and women, heroes and villains, all over the world and how they still shape our modern lives. In the U.S., in February, we celebrate a much maligned and uniquely American ethnic group with Black History Month. For every Black hero we know about, there are hundreds, if not thousands, that we never have heard of, or whose stories have been whitewashed. This is what happened to the gentleman I'll be talking about today. His story has been amalgamated into so many tales of expansion and the Wild West. As a Deputy U.S. Marshal, he is credited with over 3,000 bounty returns, including his own son, with only 14 confirmed kills. This man truly epitomizes the mythical spirit of the West, with a lot less spotty history than most of his white counterparts. This is the life and times of Bass Reeves, Black man, lawman, Superman, and Victorian influencer. Bass Reeves was born sometime in June of 1838 and was named after his grandfather, Bass Washington. Marshal Reeves' family was enslaved on the plantation of Arkansas state legislator William Steele Reeves. The Reeves plantation was located in Crawford County, Arkansas, until 1876, when William Reeves moved his entire household to Grayson County, Texas. At the outbreak of the American Civil War, William Reeves' son, George R. Reeves, became a colonel in the Confederate Army. Colonel Reeves took Bass with him. It was relatively common for enslavers to take enslaved men and women with them on campaigns. These enslaved people would serve as everything from camp servants to, unfortunately, cannon fodder. Several enslavers who could afford the reduction in labor provided the Confederate Army with whole platoons. Accounts do vary, but it is believed that Marshal Reeves served the colonel as a body servant, acting as part valet, part companion, and part human shield. It is known that Reeves self-liberated during this time. The legend is that Reeves, offended after a night of drinking and gambling, decked Colonel Reeves, knocking him out with a single blow. This is not impossible for a man standing 6'2" and weighing in at 180 pounds, though he was known as a soft-spoken, well-mannered gentleman. While he was in hiding from man-catchers, Reeves was protected by several family groups from the nations of Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee. He learned several skills that would serve him well later in life, from tracking and bushcraft to several of the languages spoken by the Plains peoples. Marshal Reeves may have served in the regular and irregular Indian regiments of the Union. During this time, Marshal Reeves met Nellie Jean. They married in 1864 and welcomed the first of their 11 children, Sally, that same year. After hearing he was legally free, Marshal Reeves returned to Arkansas to the town of Van Buren. He and Nellie farmed in Van Buren for about 10 years, expanding their family with 4 more children: Robert in 1866, Harriet in 1868, Georgia, known as George, in 1870, and Newland in 1873. Reeves occasionally took a break from farming to lead U.S. Marshals into indigenous land to hunt for outlaws and other fugitives. In 1857, Isaac Parker was appointed judge to the Indian Territories, land comprised chiefly of what is modern Oklahoma. Judge Parker instructed his newly appointed U.S. Marshal, James F. Fagan, to hire and deputize 300 souls to patrol and keep the peace in the Indian Territories. One of Marshal Fagan's first hires was an illiterate, formerly enslaved farmer out of Van Buren. Now officially a Deputy U.S. Marshal, Reeves moved his family from Van Buren to Fort Smith. Between 1875 and her death in 1896, Nellie Reeves welcomed 6 more children. Edgar in 1876, Bass Jr., 1877 to 1901, Alice May, 1872 to 1966, Benjamin H. Bass, from 1880 to 1958, Lula, from 1881 to 1889, William, 1887 to 1942, and Homer, 1882 to 1903. Marshal Reeves and others working under Marshal Fagan, Heck Thomas, Bud Ledbetter, Bill Tolman, and others patrolled an area roughly 75,000 miles looking for outlaws, often making 800-mile round trips. Judge Parker was notoriously a hanging judge and had no issue with warrants coming in dead, as it saved him time. Like most freed people of this time, Reeves could neither read nor write. He would memorize warrants, often up to 30 at a time, only coming back to Fort Smith and his family when he had apprehended all 30. He would take only a wagon, a cook, and a posse man, usually from one of the indigenous families that he stayed with during the war, and be gone for months. He was a genius. He would apprehend his quarry through guile, smarts, and the judicious application of disguises. Reeves was the Black Sherlock Holmes. He would recount stories of his arrest, disguised as a cowboy, a farmer, a traveling salesman, even an outlaw. In one tale, he knocked on a door asking for water, for he was on the run. The lady of the house invited him in and fed him. Her 2 sons, which were his quarry, came home. They enjoyed a wonderful dinner. After dinner, when the sons were asleep, Reeves slapped the handcuffs on them and marched them straight to Fort Smith. As his arrest count mounted, so did his reputation. Coming back from hunting outlaws, he was often seen with bullet holes in his hat and jacket, but none in his body. Several times when outlaws knew Reeves had hit their warrant, they would self-surrender to Fort Smith and to Judge Parker's tender mercies. One of these was the outlaw Queen Belle Starr, a notorious outlaw in her own right and the childhood friend of many other anti-hero outlaws of the West. But that's a story for another episode. Marshal Reeves is what tabletop gamers would call lawful neutral. He was quoted as saying, "Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the only one we got, and without it, we got nothing." When the warrant for his son, Benjamin Benny Reeves, came across his desk, he did not hesitate. Benny had shot and killed his estranged wife in an altercation over infidelity. Marshal Reeves brought him to Fort Leavenworth in 1902. Mr. Reeves' sentence was eventually commuted on model behavior in 1914, 4 years after his father's death. Marshal Reeves served as Deputy U.S. Marshal for over 30 years, initially serving out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, then transferring to Paris, Texas, and eventually landing in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He would stay in Muskogee even after Indian Territory became the great state of Oklahoma. Marshal Reeves became Officer Reeves at the age of 68, retiring 2 years later. He eventually succumbed to nephritis, Bright's disease, on January 12, 1910. Contemporaries and fellows sang his praises. Muskogee Times-Democrat wrote that in the early days, when the Indian country was overridden with outlaws, Reeves would herd into Fort Smith, often single-handed, bands of men charged with crime from bootlegging to murder. He was paid fees in those days that sometimes amounted to thousands of dollars for a single trip that sometimes lasted for months. To mark Marshal Reeves' passing, the Muskogee Phoenix wrote of the legendary lawman, "In the history of the early days of eastern Oklahoma, the name Bass Reeves has a place in the front rank among those who cleaned out the old Indian territory of outlaws and desperadoes. No story of the conflict of government's officers with those outlaws, which ended only a few years ago, with the rapid filling up of the territory with people, can be complete without mention of the Negro who died yesterday. During that time, he was sent to arrest some of the most desperate characters that ever infested Indian territory and endangered the life and peace within its borders. And he got his man as often as any of those deputies." Muskogee Police Chief Bud Ledbetter, who served as deputy marshal with Marshal Reeves, said about him, "The veteran Negro deputy never quailed when facing a man." When The Lone Ranger premiered on WXYZ radio in 1933, people who knew Reeves, including those serving in the federal prison in Detroit, noticed some uncanny similarities between this fictional white lawman and the historical black one. Reeves only rode on white stallions, naming at least one silver. He would often leave a silver bullet as a calling card. His posse members came exclusively from indigenous nations. He was a master marksman with pistols and rifles, and out of his over 3,000 arrests, he only killed 14. Bass Reeves is making a name for himself again, this time on his own 2 feet. He has been mentioned or portrayed in film and television so many times. I learned about him watching an episode of Gunslingers, Season 2, Episode 4, The Real Lone Ranger. Last year, he was fictionalized in the Netflix movie The Harder They Fall, portrayed by the incomparable Delroy Lindo. This year, he will be seen in the prequel to 1883, which itself is a prequel to Yellowstone. In this new Paramount Plus show, he will be played by David Oyelowo. I genuinely hope that we will see much more of Marshal Reeves' story in the future. It's a story that needs to be told. He was a great American, a great lawman, and an authentic Victorian influencer. That playground N-word is getting me frustrated. Eyeline test. 1, 2. Oyelowo. 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 How do you pronounce? Oh, that's right. Internet. English. I speak it. I wrote this. I should get it. 3.